So welcome to session 2 of Modern PBL. We're going to be looking at everything from the role of direct instruction to assessing student understanding. We'll take a look at feedback, working on projects, and then we'll end on presentations. So let's go ahead and we'll get started here. All right, so directing, assessing, presenting in the classroom. Like I said, we're looking at role of direct instruction, assessing student understanding, feedback, and working on projects, as well as presentations. So when we look at the role of direct instruction, we can either have too little or way too much. So some educators, they really need to be able to step back and just allow students to really navigate their own learning. And then some educators, they try to steer the project so rigidly. And this was something that I did very early on in my career. I tried to steer a project so rigidly that it really undermined the whole essence of student autonomy and exploration. The students had to do a project exactly according to my expectation, my standard, like I would provide them with the exemplar. This is what it's going to look like. And it was more them trying to copy what I had already established was going to be a perfect project. So we really need to figure out this balance of how to guide students through a project, facilitate that exploration, and then still allow that personal investment in student learning. So the students still have to be able to take that ownership in what they're doing. So let's take a quick look at this role. So like I said, it is all about striking that balance. And a lot of this comes from when I spoke with Ron Berger about, how do you really guide students without stepping on their toes and making sure that the process still moves forward. Because he said, that too little guidance, if we just open the doors up and say, go and do, it's going to lead to chaos. There's not enough structure there for a lot of students to be able to navigate the steps that they need to take in order to get a project accomplished. So too little guidance is going to lead to absolute chaos in your classroom. But too much guidance is really going to stifle their creativity. And that's one of the things that has been this balancing act within my classroom, is trying to give students enough structure that they can make the progress, but not be so involved in what they're designing and what they're implementing that it takes away from their unique approach to the content. So you do need to, like I said, be involved, but not too controlling, so as to help students when they need it, while also letting them learn independently. And a lot of that is done through check-ins. So what I want you to do is I really want you to think through how has your balance between too little and too much guidance impacted student engagement in your classroom. So I'll give you, just about a minute to really reflect on that of, how have you balanced that oversight of a project? Is it too much, not enough? Have you dealt with the chaos? Or is it more that Because to be honest with you, when I was so rigid in how I had students doing projects, I did have a student tell me, he said, "I hate your projects. I absolutely hate your projects." And as offended as I was, because I was like, okay, we're doing projects in class. This should be fun. It should be engaging. Why on earth would he hate my projects? And it took me some time to really understand that he was saying, I hate your projects. He didn't have any autonomy in what he was designing, how he was representing the content that he was learning. He had no role in it, none. It was all a matter of how much control I had. And being able to release a lot of that control, it's scary, but it is also extremely rewarding when you see students take that ownership, take the reins, and really go with a project and make something absolutely incredible. And what I've found is that students are way more creative than I ever was when it came to projects. And not only that, they also created things that had I assigned that, I'm sure parents would have flipped out. That why are you asking my child to make something so over the top? But when it was a student that designed it, all of a sudden that project, they took ownership of it. They were super proud of it. They were willing to invest the time and energy because it was a reflection of them and their interests and their passions, as well as their mastery of content. It didn't really have anything to do with me. It wasn't about me, and it wasn't about them copying my expectation. Does that make sense? So, assessing student understanding. This is something that is pivotal in a PBL classroom because we have to check in on a regular basis with students to ensure that they are mastering content. Because you would hate for a student to get all the way to the end of their project and they didn't really understand anything that they were covering in class. And it became more of a craft than a project. Because what I don't want to ever see happen is for a student to make something that is unrelated to the content that we're covering. They just wanted to make something to make something. And I've told students this often that if they make a roller coaster out of toothpicks, and it is the most amazing roller coaster design I've ever seen, but they can't connect it to content, they're not passing, they're not internalizing. And so it's not necessarily about the ornateness of a project or how over the top it is. If they can't connect it to what it is we're studying, they made a craft and not a project. And so we have to assess student understanding throughout the course of the unit that we're covering. So a way that I do that is through an assignment called Connect the Dots. And we'll get into that in just a minute. There's also peer review, just getting that feedback from their peers as they're working on a project and allowing them to collaborate. Collaboration's huge within a PBL classroom. Feedback loops, being able to have those micro conversations where you're just checking in and following up with a student and seeing, where they are in their understanding of content. And the conversation can be 30 seconds. It doesn't even have to be, a 3-minute conversation where you're quizzing them on different questions. So you can do formative mastery evaluations. My students take a mastery check at the end of each lesson so that they can gauge their understanding. And it truly is more about them gauging their understanding than it is about passing a quiz. Because the students are able to take this mastery check multiple times until it is passed. So I don't grade them. It's just about checking in and checking their understanding. Because once you start grading those formative assessments, all of a sudden your students are working for a grade instead of working to master and understand content. Because they just want the grade. They want to make sure that they got an A or they got a B, and that they can move on. And when you allow students the opportunity to be honest in where they are with their understanding, say they don't pass a mastery check, but they're given the opportunity to retake it. The reason they have the opportunity to retake it is because I desperately want them to understand that content. I want them to master the content. So when we allow them to retake those different assignments, then all of a sudden our focus is on mastery and not on a grade. So it internalizes the learning. So connect the dots. This particular assignment I have found to be extremely helpful because often our students, if we're having them take notes, they're going to take notes just to take notes and they write words down without connecting ideas. They're just completing a task. And there are many times when students have taken notes in class and they don't remember anything that the lesson was about. They just completed the notes and they moved on to the next thing. What this does is it slows them down. So they've taken their notes, and then this enables students to see how different pieces and parts of the lesson connect. And it also allows me, because I look over every single one of these with this individual student. So they have to bring this to me and check in and say, this is my connecting the dots. And I know what pieces and parts should be there, but I'm able to see how students make these various connections. So we look at nouns. A lot of it's, who are the people that are mentioned within this lesson? What are the dates? What are the locations? So who was involved? What happened? Where did it happen? When did it happen? And any objects that are mentioned. So say, for me, because I teach social studies, we're looking at the Declaration of Independence, and I need to make sure that Declaration of Independence shows up on this particular document. And then they can branch off from that, and they could have John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and all of these different colonists that helped form that document. And what was John Adams' role? And so they draw a connecting line, and on that line they would write how John Adams is connected to the Declaration of Independence. So they have to go back through their notes and really look at the notes to understand how the different ideas connect. So it slows students down from rushing through information just so they can go work on their project, and it shifts the effort into processing of information instead of just completing a task. So I found this to be a really, really valuable document. And every document that you see in the presentation, I will have a separate document at the end that has links to all of these things so that you could use them with your students in your classroom. Yes, Sherry.
Would you teach, just because I noticed that the notes are exactly on the line, would you have a mini teaching group for students who needed to just practice that skill with transferring, listening to their original notes, transferring, and then connecting the ideas?
Yes. And actually, what we do a lot of times is we'll go through this as a class to get them really moving in the right direction so they understand the process. Because I found, and this happened even last year, I had a class that it was a new group of seventh graders because I had the privilege of having seventh grade and eighth grade. And so they get to loop with me from one year to the next. My eighth graders, they've got this, they know how to do it. Seventh grade, I said, okay, this is what I want you to do. And it did not click. So I was like, all right, we've got to pause. We've got to meet kids where they are. And we went through it together as a class. Once we started going through it as a class, all of a sudden, the amount of detail was drastically improved. We even went through notes and we highlighted notes to show, okay, this is what I'm putting in my connecting the dots. This is what I'm going to, I need to go through and I need to find all my dates and highlight those in a particular color. They highlighted names in a different color so that they knew which pieces and parts to bring into this particular assignment. So yes, teaching this is going to be a huge skill because as they continue to develop this skill, this is going to become second nature for a lot of your students throughout the course of the year. They just automatically will transfer their notes in this way.
Very cool.
All right. The other thing that we do is called turn and talk. Um, and this allows, I have students pair up and we look at big ideas. This gives them an opportunity to talk through the content that they've learned, because a lot of times they just need to be able to talk through it. And the more that they can talk about it and hear about it from a peer, the more clarity they have. And they'll talk through big ideas that were mentioned in a lesson. They'll talk through smaller details, things that really stood out to them. They'll talk about any questions that they have, because sometimes I may not necessarily have explained something very well. And if all of a sudden a student has a question, their peer has the same question, now that's a really, really valid question to ask in class. So when I ask a class, does anybody have any questions about what you've just learned? We have some very valid questions that get to come up and be addressed. And it eliminates the, students like, well, what's for lunch? We're not talking about lunch right now. We're talking about this content. So these questions are really focused on the content that's been covered, and they've already had the opportunity to chat with a peer about this. And this allows, if two students have a question, I'm sure 3 or 4 or 5 students may have the exact same question. So it allows us to address something as a whole class, instead of if you had a question individually, but your peer was able to explain it to you, then we're good to go and we can move forward. You understand differently now than when you walked into class. Your question got answered. So it allows for questions that are addressed as a whole class to be more, I don't want to say more authentic or more valid questions, but it's questions that the whole class may need more clarification on. And then we deal with the scaffolding aspect of it. And how does the content that we just learned build upon what we've learned before? How can I make connections to other things that I've learned, other books that I've read, other characters that I understand, other concepts from different courses, and bring those different concepts into this one particular lesson? How can you make those connections? So giving students that opportunity to really just sit and chit chat through what they've learned is a huge skill builder, because it teaches them how to talk about content, how to listen about content, and how to reflect on content. Now, feedback loops and micro conversations. Again, these are formative assessments. They do not need to be graded. I can't stress that enough. They do not need to be graded. These are just conversations that you're having with students. Because if you do notice that a student is that they have gaps in their understanding, this is your opportunity to redirect them and say, I'd like for you to go back and address this in your understanding, because you do not want them to apply misinformation or a misunderstanding of content to their project, because then their project is going to go off in a direction that it shouldn't. So you can then clear up issues. You can boost motivation. I love being able to tell a student, that is fantastic. I love that connection that you made. And I want you to share that. So as you're going around the room and you're listening to them talk, especially during that turn and talk time, if you hear a student that says something great, let them know that and share that and tell them, I want you to share that when we come back as a whole group, because that was amazing. So it promotes inclusion, because you're telling that student your understanding is valid. That is amazing. And I'm so proud of you for how you came to that conclusion. You can guide behavior this way. It's not, addressing things as a whole class. It's individual, and you can guide their behavior appropriately. You can help build relationships with, within your classroom. So it's not just about peer to peer, but you can build that relationship teacher to student. And that is huge when it comes to when students are working on projects, because they know you are invested in them. And then they're going to work even harder to produce a great project. And then because this isn't a one-time check-in, it's a loop. They're able to provide feedback on, how they think that they're doing. You provide feedback to them, and then you check in again and again and again. And it's going to really build a great narrative for when it comes time to an assessment, because you know exactly how they're processing content, you know how to help them, you know the connections that they're making, and when you can check back in on their projects and you know the direction that they're headed with it, all of a sudden they know that you are invested in what they're doing, and they take a lot of pride in that. A lot of pride. So you can do classroom activities for formative assessments. Like I said, connect the dots is a great classroom activity. You can do think, pair, share, Socratic seminars. These are great activities in class that allow you to really see how students process information. Fishbowl, I would suggest, if you've never seen a fishbowl activity, essentially what it is, you have a group that's working and discussing a topic in the middle of a classroom, and then you have their peers on the outside watching and listening to this conversation. And then they provide feedback to the peers that are on the inside of that. I got a question here that says, how do you structure check-ins in a way that allows you to get to each one in a timely manner? One of the things that I do to really structure that is, you don't spend a ton of time. It's a matter of just checking in. So say 30 seconds, a minute, because if you have 30 students and you're spending a minute with every student, that's half an hour of your class checking in. Um, and but it is really important. That's the most valuable minute that you could spend with that student, is making sure that they have your attention, they're seen, they're heard, you're able to give that feedback to them. But because the majority of the class time is not spent in lecture mode, I have the opportunity to really engage with them on that individual level. So just going around and checking in with students, it doesn't have to be, a 5-minute conversation, because you're not going to get to everyone. But if you even wanted to set it up as a station in which you had a small group that you allowed that group to chit chat, and you could spend 5 minutes with that whole group answering questions. And you may even find out that, I don't need to spend 5 minutes. 3 minutes is plenty, or 2 minutes. But I'm going to have this group over here. We're going to talk. And then it may be something where working in that small group is better, because more questions get answered more quickly, and you can address understanding. The only real caveat to that is, when you're able to talk to a student individually, one, you can address certain things with that specific student that may not necessarily need addressed with everybody within that group. And so it's about maximizing their time and your time with them, so that within my classroom, there's always something to be doing. There's always something to be working on. There's never really downtime. So if I'm working with a single student, everybody else is still working on tasks that they need to be working on. And whether that may be, some students are ready to work on their project and they're ready to go and implement what they've learned, whereas other students may be finishing something up that they need to finish up before they come and have that conversation with me. Because there's many times where I'll call a student's name and they're like, Mr. Jones, I'm not ready yet. I'm like, okay. And then I move on to the next student who is ready. And then it allows them that autonomy and freedom, that they know that they have stuff that they need to do. They want to present their best work to you and their best understanding to you so that when you have that conversation, they're ready to go. They're good to go. Does that help explain that? Okay, awesome. Another game that I have developed for use in my classroom is spoons. If you're familiar with the card game Spoons, where you have to have like four of a kind, and then there's like a set of, say you have five players, there are four spoons in the middle, so somebody's always left out that doesn't get a spoon. Um, I did this with colonial regions in the United States, and they had to find a relationship between like religion, economics, the topography, and maybe like who some of the founders were of different regions. And once they had their match, then they could grab a spoon. And so developing these sorts of games, I did a similar game about the Middle Ages, and they had to connect different things like with four cards that dealt with knights, or four cards that dealt with nobility, or four cards that dealt with disease. So certain things like that. And all of a sudden, as they're playing this, they're continuously studying and focusing on content and making sure that they understand and understand well, because there's always that accountability piece built in to whatever game we play, because their peers are going to hold them accountable, because if they're not winning, they're going to make sure that you're right and that your cards are correct. And so these sorts of things really build community within a classroom. It makes the classroom a lot of fun. They're going over content. So these formative assessments ensure that students are mastering content before they apply content to their projects. Another game that we play is called Race to the Chairs. This is so much fun, and it's completely random because I have four chairs set up in the middle of my classroom, and students are divided into four teams, and then they have whiteboards. There's a whiteboard at each chair, and a dry erase marker. And I'll ask a question. Students race to a particular chair. They write down their answer. And then whichever student has the right answer, I have a separate card that has points designated for each individual chair, but they don't know what those points are. So they can get the answer right and only get 1 point or 3 points or 5 points. It's completely random. But if they get the answer wrong, then they lose those points for their team. So they may have had a chair that was worth 5 points if they got it right, but because they didn't get it right, they lose 5 points. And it's always fun to see them get excited and energized whenever they do see, like, their team gets the points, or, a friend's team loses those points. There's always a great interaction between the students. They have a ton of fun with it. So there are lots of games, and in the book, I actually have a QR code that links to all of these games that I talk about. It's a spreadsheet, it's a Google sheet that you can add games to it, or you can, just use the games that I have put in there. I think I have like 14 different games with examples, some, picture examples, some video examples of students playing these games, everything from life-size Hungry Hippos to spoons and Race to the Chairs and such. So it's fantastic. It's fun. But that QR code, it's in there. I'd love for you to be able to access that and, start building those into your classroom routines. The other thing that you could do for formative assessments is really having students write. The more they write, the more they retain. Because it's a lot like when you write down a grocery list and leave your list at home and go to the grocery, you're more likely to remember what was on that list because you wrote it down. And you may not remember everything, but you're going to remember a lot. And so when we have students write, it stores memories in the brain differently than even when they type. I believe it was Stanford that did a study on this, that handwritten content, it just transcribes in the brain differently than keystrokes on a keyboard. So when we have students write summaries over what they learned, or they do journals or learning logs. And truly, a learning log, it's just them processing information. So, a turn and talk truly is a learning log. They're processing the ideas. But it's just a verbal one. So it's, going over big ideas, small details. They could even ask questions in their learning log of things maybe that they didn't understand, and then talk about things that they connected this content to, from their past learning. So learning logs, if you can do them written, fantastic. But if you want to do learning logs even verbally, that's also a good thing too. So learning logs, journals, summaries, those are all great ways to have students process information and easy ways for you to check in, and see how they're doing with that. Google form, quizzes and exit tickets. I do a lot of my mastery checks on Google Forms because it grades it instantly and students get that instant feedback. They know what they know. They also know what they don't know, and they know what they need to go back and study. So when we look at all of that, which I really want you to think through, which specific methods resonate most with your current teaching style, and how might you adapt them to best serve your unique group of learners? I know that every classroom is unique. Every year when I get new students, I can't just copy and paste what I did from the year before. I need to make sure that I am meeting the students that I have, the students directly in front of me, and ensure that what we're doing is meeting their needs specifically, especially when you have a diverse group within one class. How do you meet everybody's needs? So, a lot of times, these different formative assessments can really help build community. It can help students learn how to work together. So hopefully something has resonated with you. And the other thing that I learned is you don't have to do it all. You don't have to do all of those things in order for a classroom to function well. Because I was trying to do a lot of different steps, and then it got to a point where students were overwhelmed and they didn't know what step was next or which step that they missed. And keeping track of all of those steps can be a bit overwhelming. So if you can reduce it to a manageable amount, something that's very streamlined for your students, then great. So figure out what that is for your students in your class, and they'll benefit tremendously from that. But it is really important to have formative assessments of some sort. I would try to build in those hands-on activities, those games in some way. And you don't even have to do it every time, but at least a few times within a unit. It's something for students to look forward to. Announce it. Hey, we're going to be playing this game. It's a reason for students to want to come to class. They're going to be excited about being there, and they're going to ensure that they are there because they don't want to miss it. So when students are working through a project, there are times when students work individually, and there are times when they work whole class. So individually, it's fantastic because it's interest and passion based. This is all about them and their internalization of this content. So it offers student choice. There's deeper buy-in. Like I said, when I had students that were crafting their own projects, they were investing hours into this project. They would go home and invest hours into their project because they loved it. It was something that they already were interested in, and they wanted to continue to develop that project. I had a student who loved Minecraft, and he rebuilt Rome in Minecraft. He built the Colosseum, he built different temples. He even went as far as to put in a gutter system, so that they had a sewer system and all sorts of different things. And it was all stuff that if I would have assigned that, that would have been an overwhelming task, but it was something that he wanted to do. And he invested, I think it was over 40 hours into this one project because he designed it. It was meaningful to him. Um, and like I said, the learning's driven by the student. The student's the one that takes that ownership. It's relevant and meaningful. The student's not going to want to work on something that isn't relevant to them and has no meaning to them. They're not going to be nearly as invested in that project, unless they are the ones that craft it, and it's full of their interests and their passions. Now, when we look at, something that could be whole group, you have a collective diversity. Everybody's working together. So students see something as, this isn't just about me, this is bigger than me. And they can have roles and responsibilities. We deal with conflict resolution. And that's something that's going to have to be taught. You're going to have to teach students how to resolve conflict within their classroom work environment. So if we can teach them how to do that as kids, they're going to be more effective as adults when they do that. So, and they see their things as pieces and parts of a whole. They understand how this is all going to work together. So if you're doing research on a community event, so if you're looking at, you want to be able to tell the stories of various veterans within your community, and somebody may be working on the editing piece of that, or somebody may be working on the writing. Somebody may be working on gathering all the contacts of people who need to be interviewed. So there are lots of roles and responsibilities, and they understand that my piece is really important. It's really important if this is going to be done well. And that is a lot of the buy-in. They have to understand that they're a part of this. And it's not a small part. Every part is important. So when we talk collaboration, a lot of times when we think group projects, you've got one person that does all the work, and you have 3 students who take all the credit. So what we don't want is for that to ever happen. And so even though my students are working in teams, they're responsible for understanding all of the content within that project. So it's not you do your piece and part and you only have to know about that piece and part. No, I need them to understand all of the content and how all of the content fits into their role. So it's about working together and not working independently within a group setting. Does that make sense? So I talk about teams, and students are given individual non-overlapping roles, but they're pieces and parts that are part of a larger production. So group work, they often work together to accomplish something larger, but everybody's still expected. So you have to really figure out how do you want to structure and explain the collaboration aspect. Do you want them working in teams? Do you want them to be working in groups? And I do think that these two differentiated pieces are important. I had 2 students that were working together on a particular project, and it was about colonial America. And it goes back to that colonial region unit where they were looking at religion and agriculture or the economy, founders, things like that. And they wanted to work together. I said, okay, you both still have to learn all the content though. And they said, okay. So what they did was they developed a tea set. And that one student developed all the saucers for the teacups. And it had every saucer had all the content for each of the regions. And the other student designed all the teacups. So both students, their projects went together perfectly, but they all still learned all of the content. So it's about finding how they can work together, still master all the content, and not see themselves as completely independent of needing to know everything. They only want to know their part. So they need to learn everything. That's a hard and fast rule within my class. You need to understand how all of this works together to form a single unit. So that guidance piece, when students are working through a project, you need to know what resources you're providing them. So what supplies, what technology tools will they have available to them? And then support. So as the teacher, when you're guiding them through this project, ask a lot of open-ended questions, things that you're not certain necessarily what the answer is, but these are open-ended questions that you want them to provide. Like, I don't know exactly how well Stephanie may understand the content, or how well Timmy may understand the content. But if I ask an open-ended question, I'm going to get that feedback and answers that I need to be able to guide them appropriately. So peer feedback and collaboration. Please allow your students to talk. Please allow your students to work together. It's really important, because a lot of times their friends will definitely tell them if they're on the right track or if they're not. And we even talk about that in class of, how do you interact with your peers? So that's an important discussion. A lot of this stuff will not just happen. You're going to have to teach it. You have to tell your students, you have to model it for your students, what you expect from them, especially in regards to their behavior and interaction with their peers. So model and demonstrate those things. So check-ins, we've talked about those, student reflections, that whole feedback loop, and allowing students to do those learning logs. That's really important. Encourage exploration and autonomy. The number of times I tell students, I don't know, go find out. Because a lot of times our students do expect us to be all-knowing and to know absolutely everything there is to know regarding our content. And the truth of the matter is, we don't. And it's really important for them to hear us say, I don't know, because all of a sudden that makes you human. And it makes it so that, you know what, they could find something out that their teacher doesn't know. And that's empowering for them. And when you say, you know what, when you find out, come back and tell me, you have empowered them to go gather knowledge and add to the conversation. So it is never a bad thing to tell your students, I don't know. That's a fantastic question. And it's also kind of empowering to students when they're like, I asked something that the teacher didn't know. This is fantastic. This is a great day. And so it really is okay to say, I don't know. But when students are also given the opportunity to go in a completely different direction on a project, and they explain that to you, and you're like, I don't know if that could work, but they explain it, and then all of a sudden it's like, that is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Give them that freedom to go explore and design so that it is their project. It is wholly theirs. And you can still help give that guidance and direction along the way, but it's not necessarily something that you have crafted for them, which is fantastic. So, and support the community. So the community aspect of this, and really supporting students along this process and letting them know you're doing a fantastic job. That's awesome. What an amazing connection. And I invite my administrators into my classroom all the time, because I want them to see the cool things that my students are doing. I want them to know and appreciate, this is what our 7th and 8th graders are doing. Look at this. This is brilliant. And it is amazing for them to walk in and see and talk to a student who can explain why they've designed a project the way that it is and why it's meaningful to them. And a student feels validated in what they're doing. The administrators understand the chaos that's going on in your classroom, because it is chaos, but it's organized chaos. So, but bringing in that community and building that support for your students, because there's even times where I have sent students to the office to share their projects, and how validating that is for a student to realize that something that they're doing is so amazing that I desperately want them to share it. And especially share it with the authorities within the school. So highly encourage that. It's very rewarding for your students. Now, motivating learners. We know that apathy is a real issue within our classrooms. This is not something that is just going to go away on its own, and students do need to be motivated. There is an acronym that was developed. It was conceived by Joyce Epstein. It was adapted by Carol Ames, and it is TARGET. It deals with task, authority, recognition, grouping, evaluation, and time. We're going to go over each one of these if we have time. So when we look at task, this is whatever you have your students doing needs to be meaningful, engaging, and moderately challenging. It should not be just a very, very simple task that can be over and done. It should be challenging. The students need to be able to feel challenged, but also capable. It can't be too hard, otherwise students will give up. So whatever we're asking our students to do, they need to be able to do it. It should promote understanding and mastery rather than just rote memorization. We don't want kids just sitting there memorizing fact. We want them to internalize this content. So whatever we're asking them to do should help them to internalize information. Whatever project they're working on should help them to internalize that information. And classroom discussions, surveys, allowing students to propose project ideas. All of that needs to align. We have to align our tasks more closely with those individual interests. What do your students like to do? So this is very individual based, but it also has to be very meaningful for your students. If we want them to want to do it, we have to ensure that they're able to do it and feel good about it when it's done. All right, authority. So they have to have some sort of autonomy or control over the learning process, which may mean that not every student is at the exact same place at the exact same time doing the exact same thing. So some kids, like I said before, there are students where I'll call their name and ask them to come up and see me so I can look over what it is they're doing or how they've processed information. And the student says, I'm not ready yet. That's because they're working on content at a different pace than what other students are working. And that has to be okay. As long as the work is getting done and they're moving forward, I tell students that they can work at their own pace as long as it's not no pace. No pace is not their pace. It has to still be a pace that meets like a deadline. You can set deadlines, absolutely, but allow students some flexibility in what it is they're working on at any given moment within the classroom. So not everybody has to do the exact same thing at the exact same time. So they're more likely to take ownership and they're seen as a person and not just part of a machine getting something done. You understand that this student needs a little bit more time. This student is able to run a little bit faster through the content, enable them to do that. So offer structured choices to students, providing a range of options. You can either do this or that. Give them a choice board of some sort so that there's always something for them to be working on while they're in the classroom. There's never this idle downtime of I am going to sit here because I have nothing to do. Now, there are times when I do allow kids to sit and have, just a moment of like, I just need to breathe for a minute. And they get that moment, then they're back to work. So it's not about distracting their peers in that moment. It's about taking a moment for themselves and then allowing them to move forward. So offer them a range of activities that they could be working on, different assessments. They know that they need to complete this or that. They need to have this conversation with you, or they need to have a conversation with their peer before moving on to their next thing. but it's a guided framework for mastering content and then applying that content within their project. Recognition. Based on individual improvement and effort rather than comparing this student to that student. Johnny understands it. Why don't you? We've spent hours talking about this. Why is it you still don't get it? It's not about comparing students. It's about looking at where they were and where they are now and celebrating that. Oh my gosh, you've grown so much. This is fantastic. Look at where you started and look at where you are now. This is awesome. And just celebrating that. Foster a mastery rather than performance of, did you get an A? No, then you don't know it. This is about identifying where they were and being thrilled at where they are now. So recognition, it fosters a growth mindset. It's not about this is the way I always am, this is where I will always be. It's about seeing where they are and where can we take them. Grouping, again, avoid rigid ability grouping or tracking to enhance students' intrinsic motivation. If they feel like they're not in the smartest class, they're not going to function as though they were. So if we can make sure that there's diversity within our classrooms and ensure that, you know what, we are all working towards this goal, and this is you are valued and you're going to add so much to this class. That particular style of grouping is going to be extremely, extremely valuable. It also gives students an opportunity to interact with diverse people, and not everybody learns the way that they prefer to learn, and it fosters a dynamic, adaptable grouping environment. Again, promoting a growth mindset. So if you can provide clear roles, conflict resolution protocols, like I said, conflict resolution protocols are something you're going to have to teach your students. Because what they see on social media and maybe what they've experienced in the past may not necessarily be what you want from your students. So teaching them how to effectively resolve issues within their groups is going to be very, very important. Evaluation. Again, based on mastery. Use your standards as assessments. Did they master that standard? It's not about how many questions did they get right. Did they master the standard? Use your standards for assessments. Value the process of growth over grades. That's really important. If we want to help our students feel valued in what they are accomplishing, what they are learning, then we need to definitely value their growth. We have a question that comes in that says, when you teach 5-6, how long do you plan for a PBL unit, given if you teach the same students 5 days a week, 3 weeks, a month, just thinking about planning? Well, a lot of it goes to how many standards are you covering within a unit, because sometimes we can have a much longer unit. I know, Sherry, you had mentioned that some of your units are months. They could take 2.5 months. I'm sure you're covering more than one standard within 2.5 months. So if you can plan that your you cover maybe a few more standards, you can extend the length of a project so it's not just one standard, one project, one standard, one project. Because given that structure, you can do maybe 2 or 3 weeks per standard, but you also have to make sure that you're building in enough flex time that if there is an issue that arises, students still have the ability to get their projects done and done well. So one of the things that we talked about last time was a lot of times whatever you get, whatever time frame you give your students for a project, in your mind, double it. And if you can reduce it at at the end, great. But you've planned to encompass maybe a few more standards within a larger project. You've given yourself some wiggle room so that you make sure that those projects meet the standards that you need to cover. Um, it's not necessarily like a very specific time frame, because if you are looking at your specific group of students, you're going to know whether this project's going to take them longer or less time. But fifth and sixth grade, I would say definitely 3 weeks, especially if they're new to project-based learning, because I have a lot of my students, they come into class, this is the first time they've ever been given the freedom to design anything in school. All their projects up to this point have been very teacher-driven designs. And so when you tell students, hey, I want you to design this, all of a sudden, they don't know what to do with that. They're like, what do you mean? Design it. And I'm like, well, what are your interests? What do you like to do outside of school? How are you going to build this? What's meaningful to you? They're like, what do you mean? And so we really have to talk through a lot of those processes, because they've not been given that opportunity prior. And so hopefully, you know, now we're going to see this more often throughout classrooms. But if this is the first time your students have engaged in PBL, your units at the beginning, your projects at the beginning of the year may take longer than your projects towards the end of the year. The more fluent they become in project design, they may get much better at this, and things may go much more quickly. Does that help, Lois? All right, so we only have a few minutes. Looking at evaluation, again, based on standards, growth over grades, you can have exemplars within your classroom. Rubrics a lot of times can stifle creativity. If you are using a rubric more as a narrative, and it allows them, and we talked a little bit about that last time, using rubrics to assess where they are in the process, and not necessarily just as an end of unit grade, like you got a 4, you got an A in this category or B in this category, but allow students to reflect throughout the process. How am I doing in this particular area? Where do I need to grow? And as a teacher, if you can offer that feedback to them and use rubrics as a feedback tool and not necessarily as a grading tool, then all of a sudden the rubrics and the feedback take on a deeper meaning to the students. All right, time. Give an appropriate amount of time to learn the content is again going to boost motivation. Students need to be given an appropriate amount of time to process information. If we just expect everything to happen at the exact same pace for every single student, it's not going to work. So we have to give them that flexibility to learn at different paces, and we have to build in the appropriate amount of time for that to happen. So too little time creates a lot of pressure and anxiety of, I'll never learn all of this in that amount of time, so why bother? And it also limits their creative expressions. So use flexible timelines, checkpoints, that allows students to even set some goals for themselves. So I do have this document. It is a self-reflection of, what you currently do versus changes that you want to make in your class, going over every single one of those task, authority, recognition, grouping, evaluation, and time. And then even identifying some of your obstacles. What are going to be some serious challenges that you need to figure out ways to overcome in order to get the current to what you desperately want it to be. Now, putting it all together, pre-plan, reflect, refine. This particular document is a way for you to really plan out PBL within your classroom. So if you want to set up a unit, this is a fantastic document that's going to guide you through. This is what I want students to even do, week 1, week 2. This is how it's going. These are some of the reflections that I'm making through all of this. So really, as a, how can I as an educator revolutionize my teaching approach to ignite my students' passions, making their learning journey not only more engaging, but also deeply resonant with their individual interests and aspirations. So how can we do that? And really reflecting on that question, I think, is going to be helpful for us to create the best learning environment for our students. Now, presentation, we just have, I think it's like 2 slides left. So in dealing with presentation, we have to give our students an audience. Sometimes the audience is going to be just you. Sometimes the audience for student presentation of projects could be the school community, presenting them to administrators, getting your administrators more involved in your classroom. And I mean, a lot of times we just want to be able to shut the door and not have our administrators come in, but it's important for them to understand that they play a role within your class. And so having, students even present to the school board and inviting school board members in to see what amazing things you're doing in your classroom is really important. And you could also invite in community members, and for the students to understand that they are not making this just for their teacher, but they're making something, they're designing something that has a larger impact, and they could present their project to community members, is really rewarding to understand that their project has value beyond the classroom. So again, how can you create more authentic audiences for your students to engage with? Who are folks that you can invite into your classroom for them to present to? One of the things that I've done is I've done some distance learning with my students. When we were doing our unit on the Declaration of Independence, we collaborated with the National Archives. When we studied the US Constitution, we collaborated with the US Capitol. And my students were able to ask questions to those particular entities and know that their questions were meaningful. Never forget, one of my students asked at the National Archives, "Hey, what happens to the Declaration of Independence at night?" And the representative said, "I wish I could tell you, but that is top secret information." And all of a sudden my students were like, "Oh, I just asked something about top secret information." And they felt, one, that this was an extremely important question, a very valid question, and oh my gosh, I almost got them to answer a top secret piece of information. And it was an experience that they'll never forget. You're building collaboration and presentation of things that your students will remember the rest of their lives. And that is so important, because we're not just learning for a test, we're learning to understand content and internalize this content so that it has meaning. And it's not just about this moment, it's about bettering themselves, for the rest of their lives. This is something that we definitely want them to understand, that, there's a bigger picture here beyond just this one lesson in this one class. No student ever says, "That's the best lecture I've ever heard." It's about understanding that this is the most meaningful work I've ever done. So, our next session, it's going to be about immersive learning experiences. And we're also going to talk about flipped learning and PBL. We're going to talk about artificial intelligence and PBL, and, building those community connections. How do we invite those people into our classroom? How do we go about doing that? So it's going to really elevate your PBL classroom. These are some strategies that are just going to take it to a whole nother level. So if you have a moment and you can scan that QR code with your phone, fantastic. I'd love to get feedback on today's session and how it went. What are some things maybe that need to be done differently for our next session? And, that'll give me an opportunity to maybe revamp what we're doing and make the necessary changes for you all. But I'm also going to put into the chat the document that has the links to the various artifacts that were shown in today's session. So I'm going to go ahead and hit stop share. and find that document. And I'll put that in the chat. All right, so I'll hang out for a few minutes. And if anybody has any questions, more than happy to chat and deal with those questions. But thank you so much for being a part of this session. Really appreciate your time. Hope you have a great day.